The liquid in the syringe was halfway through the tube when Kelvin did the impossible. He reached up, wrapped his heavy paws around Gabriel's neck, and let out a sob that sounded exactly like a human goodbye. Miss Jean's hand froze mid-injection. The monitor beside them screamed numbers that didn't belong to a dying dog. Something was catastrophically, impossibly wrong. Before we uncover what Miss Jean discovered in that room, tell us, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you value the loyalty of a dog? Rate this story in the comments below and stay until the very end. The call came at 04:47 and Gabriel already had his boots on. 7 years as an elite K9 handler had rewired his nervous system to expect disaster before dawn. He sat in the barracks common room, ACU uniform crisp despite the hour, because routine was the scaffolding holding his sanity in place. The caller ID read Military Veterinary Services, Fort Bragg. They only called when the world was ending. Handler Rays, this is Miss Jean Laurent. The voice carried the careful neutrality of someone diffusing a live explosive with words. You need to report immediately. It's Kelvin. Gabriel's throat closed. What happened? He collapsed during overnight observation. Vitals dropped fast. We've got him on support, but the pause stretched like razor wire. You should be here, Gabriel. He didn't remember grabbing his tactical jacket, didn't remember running 3 stop signs through the base perimeter. All he registered was the roar of blood in his ears and a single thought cycling like a distress beacon. Hold on, brother, just hold on. Kelvin wasn't his partner. Kelvin was the reason Gabriel Reyes still drew breath on this planet. 6 years old, German Shephard, coat like iron and gold, dark saddleback that caught light like Damascus steel, tan underbelly that glowed amber in sunrise, military working dog, call sign Shadow 7, 4 deployments across 3 continents. Maury confirmed explosive detections than any canine in the battalion's decorated history. Kelvin had cleared compounds that would have swallowed entire squads. He tracked insurgents through mountain terrain that broke men and animals alike. And 14 months ago, during an ambush in a border region Gabriel still saw every time he closed his eyes, Kelvin had thrown his 60-pound body between Gabriel and a sniper's nest, taking fire that should have ended them both. Gabriel owed that dog his entire existence. And now that dog was dying, and Gabriel was doing 90 down an empty base road at dawn, because the thought of Kelvin leaving without him was more terrifying than any firefight he'd survived. He hit the clinic doors hard enough to rattle the frame. 2 handlers from his unit stood in the corridor like sentries at a funeral. Rodriguez had his arms locked across his chest, jaw working silently, eyes red-rimmed and raw. Bennett leaned against the wall with his head bowed, unable or unwilling to meet Gabriel's gaze. Both of them had served with Kelvin. Both of them owed him their lives. Neither could form words. How bad? Gabriel said. Rodriguez's voice cracked. Bad, Gabe, real bad. Miss Jean met him outside the examination suite. She was 50-something, Haitian-American, with steady hands that had delivered 1,000 hard truths and a face that had learned not to flinch while doing it. But today, her eyes carried something Gabriel had never seen there before, softness that felt like pity. That softness gutted him more than any words could. His organ function deteriorated significantly overnight, she said quietly. We've administered oxygen support, IV fluids, stimulants, everything in our arsenal. His body isn't responding. You said he was stable yesterday. He was, but something shifted. This wasn't gradual decline, Gabriel. It was sudden, like his system was fighting something we can't identify. Then identify it. We are trying, she paused, and in that pause Gabriel heard the gate closing. Command issued authorization for euthanasia. The paperwork came through at 600. The word detonated in Gabriel's chest like a breaching charge. Euthanasia. They were going to put a needle in Kelvin's vein and stop the heartbeat that had kept Gabriel's soul functioning for 7 years. They were going to kill his brother because a form said it was protocol. No, Gabriel said. Gabriel. I said no, not yet. Let me see him. She opened the door. Kelvin lay on a padded examination table wrapped in a thermal blanket. The body that had cleared obstacles and taken down armed combatants twice his size, was trembling like something fragile. His breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like each one cost him something irreplaceable. His coat, usually rich and gleaming like polished metal, looked dull and lifeless. His eyes, usually sharp enough to read threat levels from across a compound, were clouded and heavy with exhaustion that went bone deep. But when he saw Gabriel, something ignited behind the fog. Recognition, love, the fierce, unbreakable connection that had formed the day a scarred, suspicious 2-year-old dog had growled at a young handler, and the young handler had whispered, "You and me, brother, all the way," and meant it with every fiber of his being. Gabriel dropped to his knees beside the table. His scarred hands found Kelvin's face, cradling it the way he'd done 10,000 times, after missions, after nightmares, after the endless nights when the only thing keeping Gabriel tethered to humanity was the sound of this dog breathing beside him in the dark. "Hey, brother," he whispered, "I'm here." Kelvin tried to lift his head, every muscle strained. His neck shook violently with effort. He managed half an inch before gravity pulled him back down, but his paw, his front right paw, slid across the cold metal table and pressed against Gabriel's wrist, holding on. Gabriel felt every moment they'd shared crash through him like artillery fire. The first week of training, when Kelvin refused every command, and Gabriel spent every night sitting outside his kennel, earning trust one word at a time. The storm-soaked night in week 4, when Kelvin finally rested his head on Gabriel's knee and the bond locked into place like a bolt sliding home. The burning compound in Kandahar, where Kelvin led their element through smoke so thick you couldn't see your own rifle, nose working, body tense, never hesitating. The ambush that should have ended Gabriel. The sniper rounds, the chaos, the impossible weight of Kelvin's jaws on his vest, dragging him through gravel and fire while bullets carved the earth around them. This dog had given him everything, and now Gabriel knelt beside him with nothing to offer back except the warmth of his hands and words too small to carry what they meant. "You saved my life," Gabriel said, voice fracturing. "More times than I can count, you never quit, not once, you never left me behind." His breath caught. "I'm not leaving you." Miss Jean entered quietly, carrying a small metal tray. The sound of it, the soft clink of instruments, the careful placement of the syringe filled the room with pressure that made it hard to breathe. Rodriguez turned his face to the wall. His shoulders jerked once, hard, then locked rigid. Bennett pressed his fist against the doorframe and stopped moving entirely. "When you're ready," Miss Jean said softly. Gabriel couldn't speak. He wrapped both arms around Kelvin and pulled him close, burying his face in the dog's fur. He smelled like antiseptic, and underneath it like dust and rain, and every mission they'd survived together. "You did your duty," Gabriel whispered into Kelvin's neck. "You were brave every single day. You were better than all of us." His voice shattered. He couldn't finish. He held tighter because letting go felt like erasure. And then Kelvin moved. Not a twitch, not a reflex. The dog gathered whatever impossible reserve of strength remained in his broken body, strength that shouldn't exist, and lifted his trembling front paws. He wrapped them around Gabriel's shoulders. He pressed his head into the curve of Gabriel's neck, and he held on. Rodriguez made a sound like he'd been gut-punched. Bennett slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, hand covering his mouth. Miss Jean lowered her head and closed her eyes. Kelvin was hugging him, not leaning, not collapsing, hugging with deliberate, desperate, heartbreaking intention. His paws trembled against Gabriel's back. His whole body shook with the effort of staying there. And then Gabriel felt it. Something hot and wet sliding onto his shoulder. Tears. Kelvin was crying, real tears rolling from the dog's clouded eyes, soaking into the camouflage fabric of Gabriel's uniform. Each one felt like a word the dog couldn't speak. Each one landed with the weight of a goodbye that neither of them was ready for. Gabriel broke completely. The composure he'd built over 7 years of combat, the steady voice, the locked jaw, the ability to witness horror and keep moving, all of it collapsed. He sobbed into Kelvin's fur, with the raw, unguarded grief of a man who had finally found the one loss he couldn't survive. "I'm here," he choked. "I'm right here, brother. I'm not going anywhere." Kelvin pressed closer, as if the embrace wasn't enough, as if he was trying to climb inside Gabriel's chest and stay there where nothing could reach him. Miss Jean stepped forward. Her hand was steady, her eyes were not. She'd performed euthanasia countless times in her career. She'd held the hands of handlers who couldn't hold themselves together, but she had never, not once, seen a dog wrap his arms around his handler and weep. She lifted the syringe. Gabriel closed his eyes. And then Miss Jean stopped. Not slowly, not hesitantly. She stopped the way someone stops when every alarm in their training fires simultaneously. Sharp, sudden, total. "Wait," she said. Gabriel's eyes opened. Miss Jean was staring at the monitor beside Kelvin's table. The numbers were jumping erratically, not the slow fade of a dying animal, but spikes, surges, patterns that contradicted everything she'd seen in organ failure. Kelvin's heart rate was climbing. His body was jerking, not the weakness of shutdown, but involuntary response to pain. Specific pain, localized pain, the kind that originates from one source, not systemic collapse. "This isn't right," Miss Jean whispered. She set the syringe down. Her hands moved to Kelvin's rib cage, pressing gently along the left side. Kelvin yelped, a sharp, sudden cry that cut through the room like a gunshot. Gabriel flinched. Rodriguez spun around. Bennett scrambled to his feet. "That's not organ failure," Miss Jean said, her voice transforming, sorrow draining away, replaced by something harder, clinical precision. "That's focal trauma. Something is inside him." "Inside him?" Gabriel's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean inside him?" Miss Jean looked up. Her face had gone pale. "I mean his organs aren't failing because they're diseased. They're failing because something is compressing them, something foreign, something that shouldn't be there." She pulled her hands back and stared at Gabriel with an expression that carried equal parts horror and desperate hope. "We need X-rays immediately, because if I'm right, we almost just killed a dog who isn't dying. He's injured, and he's been hiding it." Gabriel looked down at Kelvin. The dog still had his paw pressed against Gabriel's wrist. His eyes were clouded, exhausted, glazed with pain that must have been unbearable. But behind all of it, burning so faint you could almost miss it, was something Gabriel recognized instantly. The same fire he'd seen the day they met. The same stubborn, furious, unbreakable will that had made a scarred, untrusting 2-year-old growl at a stranger and refuse to submit. Kelvin wasn't saying goodbye. He was asking for help. And Gabriel Reyes, who had never once failed to answer when his brother needed him in combat, was not about to fail him now. They moved fast. Miss Jean called for the portable radiography unit while Gabriel steadied Kelvin on the table. The dog was trembling harder now, each breath costing him something visible, a shudder, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker behind his clouded eyes that Gabriel recognized as the same expression Kelvin wore when he detected a threat and was deciding whether to engage or hold position. He'd been holding for God knows how long. Gabriel woke at 400 without an alarm. 7 years had rewired his circadian rhythm to military precision. His body didn't need a clock anymore, just the memory of too many pre-dawn operations where 30 seconds of extra sleep could mean the difference between breathing and a flag-draped box. The barracks room was dark and silent, except for the mechanical hum of the ventilation system, a sound so constant it had become another form of quiet. He sat up on the edge of his rack, feet finding the cold linoleum floor. The routine was sacred, not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it was the framework holding him together. Without it, he'd drift. Without it, he'd have to think about what came after the service, after Kelvin, after the only life he knew how to live. ACU uniform already laid out on the chair. Boots polished the night before. Dog tags resting on the small nightstand beside a photograph he never looked at directly but couldn't put away. Him and Kelvin after their second deployment, both of them leaner and harder than they'd been stateside, both of them alive in a way that didn't translate to garrison life. He dressed in the dark, laced his boots with the same tension every time, the muscle memory of 100 mobilizations, splashed water on his face in the communal bathroom where fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in glass, looked at himself in the mirror long enough to confirm he was still there, then looked away before the reflection could ask questions he didn't have answers for. The base was a graveyard at this hour. Street lights cast long shadows across empty motor pools. Buildings squatted in the darkness like sleeping animals. Somewhere in the distance, a gate guard's radio crackled with static and boredom. Gabriel walked the familiar route toward the K9 compound, his breath visible in the February cold, boots striking pavement in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to something he couldn't name. This was the best part of his day. The walk, the silence, the knowledge that in 3 minutes he'd open the kennel door and Kelvin would be there, already awake, already waiting, eyes bright and focused like Gabriel, was the only thing in the world worth paying attention to. 7 years they'd been a unit, 2 heartbeats, 1 mission. Gabriel had trained other handlers, worked with other dogs, but nothing came close to what he had with Kelvin. Some bonds you build through repetition and technique. Others lock into place the first time you make eye contact and recognize something of yourself staring back. Kelvin had been a problem dog when they first met, too aggressive, too suspicious, too smart for his own good. 3 handlers had washed out trying to work with him. Gabriel took one look at the scarred 2-year-old growling from the back of his kennel and saw a mirror, saw something that had been hurt and refused to trust and needed someone to prove that loyalty wasn't a lie people told before they disappeared. He'd sat outside that kennel every night for a month, didn't push, didn't demand, just sat there talking about nothing, missions, weather, the particular brand of loneliness that came with being good at violence and not much else. Week 4, during a thunderstorm that shook the compound, Kelvin had stopped growling, stepped forward, rested his head on Gabriel's knee, and the bond locked into place like a bolt sliding home. After that, they were inseparable. Kelvin slept in Gabriel's quarters despite regulations, ate breakfast while Gabriel prepped gear, deployed together, trained together, survived together. Gabriel had been shot at, blown up, and nearly drowned in a river crossing gone wrong, and every single time Kelvin had been there, pulling him out of the fire, leading him through the chaos, refusing to let him quit. 14 months ago, Kelvin had saved his life in the most literal sense possible. Sniper nest, border region, 3 rounds that should have ended Gabriel before he even registered the threat. Kelvin had thrown himself between Gabriel and the shots, taking impacts that cracked ribs and shredded muscle, but miraculously missed vitals. They'd extracted under fire with Kelvin bleeding and Gabriel screaming into the radio for medevac, convinced he was about to watch his brother die in his arms. But Kelvin survived, recovered, came back stronger, like the injury had only made him more determined to stay operational. The vets cleared him, command cleared him. Gabriel watched him like a hawk for months, but Kelvin never showed weakness, never hesitated, never gave any indication that something was wrong. Until yesterday. Gabriel had noticed it during their afternoon patrol, a slight hitch in Kelvin's gait, barely perceptible, a moment where the dog's focus wavered, eyes tightening like he was processing something internal. Gabriel had called it early, brought him back to the kennel, checked him over thoroughly. No visible injuries, no swelling, no heat. Kelvin had licked his hand and settled down like everything was fine. Gabriel had told himself he was being paranoid, told himself that after 7 years he was seeing threats that didn't exist, told himself that Kelvin was fine and he needed to stop projecting his own anxiety onto the one stable thing in his life. He reached the K9 compound and punched in his access code. The gate clicked open. He walked past rows of kennels where other dogs stirred, recognizing his footsteps but not reacting. They knew he wasn't theirs. Kelvin's kennel was at the far end, positioned where Gabriel could check on him last thing at night and first thing in the morning. The overhead light was motion-activated. It flickered on as Gabriel approached, casting harsh fluorescent light across the concrete run. And there, in the back corner, was Kelvin. Lying down, not asleep, not alert, just lying there with his head resting on his paws, breathing in shallow pulls that looked wrong. His eyes were open but clouded, fixed on something middle distance, that Gabriel couldn't see. "Hey, brother," Gabriel said softly. Kelvin's ears twitched. Recognition, but he didn't get up, didn't move, just watched Gabriel with an expression that carried exhaustion so deep it looked like gravity. Gabriel's pulse spiked. He opened the kennel door and dropped to one knee beside the dog. His hands moved automatically, checking temperature, feeling for injuries, running fingers along Kelvin's spine and ribs. Kelvin's breathing hitched when Gabriel's hand passed over his left side, a tiny flinch that most people would miss. Gabriel didn't miss anything. "What's wrong, brother?" he whispered. "Talk to me." Kelvin lifted his head just enough to press his nose against Gabriel's palm. The gesture was so tired, so unlike the fierce, unstoppable dog Gabriel knew, that fear crystallized in his chest like ice forming on a windshield. Something was catastrophically wrong. Gabriel's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out without looking away from Kelvin. The screen read, "Military Veterinary Services, Fort Bragg, 0447. His throat closed. He answered, "Handler Ray's." "Gabriel, this is Miss Jean Laurent." The voice was controlled but urgent. "You need to report to the clinic immediately. It's Kelvin." "I'm with him now," Gabriel said. "What happened?" "He collapsed during overnight observation. We brought him in for emergency monitoring. His vitals dropped fast. We've stabilized him, but..." The pause stretched like a tightrope, about to snap. "You need to be here, Gabriel, right now." The call ended. Gabriel stared at Kelvin, whose eyes were already closing again, body surrendering to something Gabriel couldn't fight with his hands. "Stay with me," Gabriel whispered. He scooped the 60-pound dog into his arms, felt how light he seemed, how wrong that felt, and carried him toward the vehicle bay at a run. The silence of the base shattered, everything shattered, and Gabriel ran through the wreckage carrying the only thing that mattered. The paperwork was already on Miss Jean's desk when Gabriel arrived, still carrying Kelvin in his arms. 3 forms printed on standard military letterhead, edges crisp and bureaucratic, language so sterile it could have been describing the disposal of spent ammunition rather than the life of a decorated war dog. Military Working Dog Decommission Authorization, MWD Kelvin, callsign Shadow 7 status. Approved for immediate euthanasia. Gabriel read the words 3 times before they registered as real. His hands tightened around Kelvin's body, feeling the shallow rise and fall of the dog's ribcage against his forearms. Kelvin's eyes were half closed, head resting against Gabriel's chest like he was trying to burrow into the only safe place left in the world. "When did this come through?" Gabriel's voice was flat, controlled, the tone he used when his hands wanted to break something. Miss Jean's jaw tightened. 0600. Command sent it directly to the clinic administrator. I didn't see it until after I called you. Gabriel set Kelvin down gently on the examination table, keeping one hand on the dog's shoulder, an anchor, a promise. Then he picked up the paperwork and read it properly. Each line was a fresh cut. Subject MWD has exhibited rapid systemic decline, inconsistent with operational readiness standards. Medical intervention costs exceed asset replacement value. Per DoD Directive 5154.31, immediate humane euthanasia is authorized to prevent unnecessary resource expenditure. Asset resource expenditure. They were talking about Kelvin like he was a vehicle with too many miles, a piece of equipment that had depreciated past usefulness. No mention of 4 deployments. No mention of the 73 confirmed explosive detections that had saved hundreds of lives. No mention of the ambush where Kelvin had taken fire meant for Gabriel and kept fighting anyway. Just numbers, just cost-benefit analysis, just a line item to be closed out. "Who signed this?" Gabriel asked. Miss Jean pointed to the bottom of the page. The signature was illegible, but the typed name beneath it read, Colonel Raymond Voss, Base Commander. Gabriel had never met Voss, never needed to. Voss operated 3 levels above Gabriel's pay grade, the kind of officer who made decisions from behind a desk and measured success in budget reports rather than body counts. The kind of commander who saw military working dogs as force multipliers with calculable ROI, not brothers who bled beside you. He doesn't even know Kelvin, Gabriel said quietly. He doesn't need to. Miss Jean's voice carried a bitterness Gabriel had never heard from her before. He just needs to sign the form. That's how the system works. The system, that vast, impersonal machine of protocols and procedures that reduced every decision to a formula, that treated sacrifice like depreciating capital, that could look at a dog who'd given everything and decide his continued existence wasn't financially justified. Gabriel had spent 7 years inside the system, had followed its orders, trusted its hierarchy, believed that somewhere up the chain, people understood what mattered. But standing here, reading this authorization that valued Kelvin's life in dollars and determined it wasn't worth spending more, he felt something crack inside his faith in the institution he'd served. There has to be an appeal process, Gabriel said. Medical review, something. Miss Jean shook her head. Not for this. Once command authorizes euthanasia on resource grounds, there's no override. It's considered a financial decision, not a medical one. My hands are tied. Your hands are holding the syringe. Gabriel, you're the one who has to do it. That makes it your decision. Miss Jean's eyes flashed. You think I want this? You think I spent 12 years in veterinary medicine so I could kill healthy dogs because some colonel balanced a spreadsheet? Her voice cracked. I have a directive. If I refuse, they'll relieve me and send someone else. Someone who won't hesitate, someone who won't even check if there's another option. Gabriel looked down at Kelvin. The dog's breathing had grown more labored in the last 10 minutes, each inhale a visible struggle. His eyes were clouded with pain he was trying desperately to hide, the same way he'd hidden every injury, every exhaustion, every moment of weakness, because his entire life had taught him that showing vulnerability meant getting left behind. He saved my life, Gabriel said. The words came out raw, stripped of the control he usually maintained. 14 months ago, sniper nest, 3 rounds. He threw himself between me and the shooter, took impacts that should have killed him, and he survived. He fought his way back because that's what he does. He never quits. Miss Jean's expression softened, but her eyes held the terrible knowledge of someone who'd seen this scene too many times. I know his record, Gabriel. I know what he's done. But the system doesn't care about heroism. It cares about operational status and budget allocations. Then the system is broken. Yes, Miss Jean said simply, it is. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of institutional failure. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Outside, a vehicle drove past. The world continued operating according to its rules and procedures, indifferent to the fact that those rules were about to end a life that mattered more than any regulation. Gabriel's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, saw a message from Rodriguez. Base legal says there's no appeal. I'm sorry, brother. Another message from Bennett. We're outside if you need us. Gabriel typed back, stay there, this isn't over. But even as he sent it, he felt the walls closing in. The system had made its decision. The paperwork was signed. The authorization was in place. And Gabriel, elite handler, decorated soldier, the man who'd faced down armed insurgents without flinching, was powerless against a signature on a form. He looked at the clock, 05:14. According to the directive, euthanasia was scheduled for 06:00, 46 minutes. That's how long Kelvin had left. Because someone in an air-conditioned office had decided his medical care wasn't cost-effective. The system treats heroes like trash. It takes dogs who have bled for this country, who have saved countless lives, who have given everything they have, and it reduces them to line items in a budget report. It calls them assets and resources instead of partners and brothers. And when those heroes need help, when they need the same loyalty they've shown every single day of their service, the system signs a piece of paper and walks away. If you believe every soul deserves respect, if you think the sacrifices of the brave shouldn't be measured in dollars, if you aren't on the side of this cold-hearted process that discards warriors the moment they become inconvenient. Hit subscribe now, because this fight isn't over. Gabriel turned back to Kelvin, whose eyes had opened slightly, fixed on Gabriel's face with an expression that held no accusation, no fear, just trust. Complete, absolute trust that Gabriel would find a way. That trust was a knife in Gabriel's chest, because for the first time in 7 years, he didn't know if he could deliver. "I need more time," Gabriel said to Miss Jean. "I can give you until 6. After that, if I don't follow the directive, they'll remove me and bring in someone who will." "Then give me until 6. Gabriel's hand rested on Kelvin's head, fingers buried in the thick fur. "And pray I find something they missed." Miss Jean nodded slowly. "I'll prep the exam room, but Gabriel," she paused, "even if we find something treatable, if Command already decided he's not worth the cost, then I'll pay for it myself. That's not how military regulations work." "I don't care how they work," Gabriel said. "I care about keeping my brother alive." He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Because if the system wanted Kelvin dead, Gabriel was about to wage war against every regulation, every protocol, every chain of command between him and the only thing in this world he refused to lose. The clock kept ticking. Kelvin kept breathing. And Gabriel kept fighting. The examination room smelled like disinfectant trying to hide something darker underneath, the scent of fear and endings that no amount of bleach could erase. Gabriel stood in the doorway for 3 seconds before he could make himself move forward. 3 seconds where his body understood what his mind was still refusing to accept. Kelvin was dying. Not might be, not could be, was. The dog lay on the padded examination table under harsh fluorescent lighting that showed every detail Gabriel's heart wanted to deny. And the first thing Gabriel saw, the thing that hit him like a physical blow, was Kelvin's coat. For 7 years, that coat had been legendary. Iron and gold, the other handlers called it. The dark saddleback that ran along Kelvin's spine and shoulders carried the deep black brown of forged metal, the kind that caught light and threw it back like polished steel. In certain angles, in morning sun or the amber glow of tactical lights, it looked almost blue-black, the color of gunmetal, of strength compressed into physical form. And beneath that, the gold, rich tan that covered Kelvin's chest and legs and face, warm as summer light, bright as new brass. When Kelvin moved, really moved, at full speed across an obstacle course or charging toward a threat, the two colors blended into something that looked like Damascus steel in motion, patterns of light and dark flowing together like he'd been forged rather than born. Gabriel had seen that coat soaked with rain in monsoon season, caked with mud after river crossings, dusted with desert sand that turned the gold nearly white. He'd seen it matted with blood, Kelvin's and others, and watched it gleam again after treatment, resilient as the dog himself. That coat was armor. That coat was identity. That coat was the physical manifestation of everything Kelvin represented, unbreakable, beautiful, fierce. Now it looked like ash. The iron had turned dull, lifeless, the deep black-brown faded to something gray and colorless. The gold had lost its warmth, gone pale, and sickly like tarnished brass left too long in the rain. The coat that used to catch light and throw it back now seemed to absorb it, swallow it into the same darkness that was consuming Kelvin from the inside. Gabriel's breath caught in his chest. This wasn't just illness. This was deterioration. This was a warrior's body giving up the fight. He crossed the room in 4 steps, his boots silent on the tile floor. Kelvin's eyes tracked the movement, slowly, with effort that shouldn't be necessary for something as simple as following motion. Those eyes had once been sharp enough to spot tripwires in low light, to read Gabriel's hand signals from 100 yards out, to lock onto threats before Gabriel's trained instincts even registered danger. Now they were clouded, filmed over with exhaustion so profound it looked like fog settling over dark water. But beneath the clouds, beneath the pain and the weariness, Gabriel saw the same intelligence that had always lived there, the same fierce awareness, the same stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. Kelvin knew exactly what was happening to him, and he was still fighting. "Hey, brother," Gabriel whispered, dropping to his knees beside the table so they were eye level. His hands moved automatically to Kelvin's face, fingers sliding into the fur that felt thinner than it should, less dense. Kelvin's skull felt too prominent beneath Gabriel's palms, the bone structure suddenly visible in a way it had never been before. When had Kelvin lost weight? How had Gabriel missed it? Because you didn't want to see it, a voice in his head answered. Because seeing it meant admitting something was wrong. Because if you acknowledged the problem, you'd have to face the possibility of losing him. Kelvin's breathing was shallow and irregular, each inhale requiring visible effort. His ribcage expanded and contracted in stuttering rhythm, like an engine misfiring. His body trembled, not from cold, but from the sheer exertion of staying conscious. Every breath was a battle. Every heartbeat was a victory that cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. Gabriel's hands moved down Kelvin's neck, feeling the muscle that used to be thick and powerful, capable of pulling Gabriel's full weight across broken ground. Now it felt diminished. The strength was still there. Gabriel could feel the tension, the coiled power that defined Kelvin even in weakness, but it was buried under layers of deterioration that didn't make sense for a 6-year-old dog in his prime. "What happened to you?" Gabriel murmured, more to himself than to Kelvin. His fingers traced along Kelvin's spine, feeling each vertebra more prominent than it should be. "What are you hiding from me?" Kelvin's tail moved. Not a wag, he didn't have the energy for that, but a single deliberate thump against the padded table. Acknowledgement, communication, the same signal he'd used 10,000 times before. "I hear you, I'm here, we're good." Except they weren't good. They were the furthest thing from good. Gabriel's vision blurred. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears form. Kelvin didn't need to see him break. Kelvin needed to see strength, needed to believe that Gabriel had this under control, that there was a plan, that everything would be okay because Gabriel always made things okay. But Gabriel didn't have a plan. He had 40 minutes before a directive he couldn't fight would end the life of the only thing he'd ever loved unconditionally. He pressed his forehead against Kelvin's, breathing in the scent that was purely, uniquely Kelvin. Underneath the antiseptic and the sickness, there was still the smell of dust and work and loyalty. The smell of every mission they'd survived together. The smell of home, even though neither of them had ever had a real one. "I'm not giving up on you," Gabriel whispered against Kelvin's fur. "You hear me, brother? I don't care what the paperwork says. I don't care what command authorized. You didn't quit on me when that sniper had me pinned. You didn't quit when you took those rounds. You've never quit on me, not once in 7 years." His voice cracked. He didn't try to hide it. "So I'm not quitting on you." Kelvin's eyes closed slowly, then opened again. The effort it took for that simple gesture, the energy required just to keep his eyelids from surrendering to gravity, was visible, excruciating. But he did it anyway, because that's what Kelvin did. He fought. He endured. He refused to let go until someone he trusted told him it was okay. And Gabriel would never tell him that, would never give him permission to stop fighting. Because the moment Gabriel said those words, the moment he released Kelvin from the duty of staying alive, the world would become a place Gabriel didn't know how to exist in. Miss Jean entered quietly, her footsteps deliberate so as not to startle them. She stood at a respectful distance, giving them space, but her presence filled the room with the weight of what came next. "We have 37 minutes, she said softly. Gabriel didn't look up. His hands remained on Kelvin's face, thumbs stroking the soft fur beneath the dog's eyes, one of the few places where the gold still held a hint of its original warmth. "Then we'd better find out what's killing him," Gabriel said, "because I'm not letting him go without a fight." Kelvin's tail thumped once more against the table. Agreement, partnership, trust. The way it had always been. The way it would be until the very end. 14 months ago, border region. Grid coordinates Gabriel would never forget no matter how hard he tried. The memory hit him like it always did. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, dragging him back to the moment his life split into before and after. They'd been running an interdiction patrol, 8 operators, and two K9 teams tracking a high-value target through terrain that looked like God had given up halfway through creation. Scrub brush and rock formations that offered concealment but no real cover. Dry riverbeds cutting through the landscape like scars. Heat that turned the air into something visible, shimmering and distorting distance until you couldn't trust what you were seeing. Gabriel had point position with Kelvin, ranging 15 meters ahead, nose working the ground in systematic sweeps. The dog moved like liquid shadow, all efficiency and focus, ears rotating to catch sounds Gabriel's human senses couldn't process. They'd been operational for 6 hours. Everyone was sharp but tired, that dangerous combination where training keeps you moving but exhaustion slows your reaction time by fractions of a second. Fractions that kill. The compound appeared suddenly, 3 structures clustered around a dried well, walls made of sun-baked brick that blended into the landscape until you were almost on top of it. Intel had tagged it as abandoned. Reconnaissance had confirmed no heat signatures. The whole thing should have been a routine clear and move. Should have been. Kelvin stopped 30 meters out. His body went rigid in the posture Gabriel knew, as well as his own heartbeat. Target acquisition. Alert, threat detected. Gabriel raised his fist. The element halted. 8 rifles came up simultaneously, sectors covered, spacing maintained. Perfect execution of training drilled into muscle memory. "What have you got, brother?" Gabriel whispered. Kelvin's ears were locked forward, focused on the central structure. A low growl built in his chest, not the warning growl he used for wildlife or civilians, but the combat growl that meant armed hostiles. His hackles rose, the iron and gold coat standing on end in a ridge down his spine. Gabriel keyed his radio. "Shadow 7 has contact, central building, unknown numbers." The team leader's voice crackled back, "Proceed with caution, K9 sweep first." Standard protocol. Send the dog in to draw fire, identify positions, give the operators tactical advantage. It was effective, it was doctrine, and it treated Kelvin like the expendable scout he was classified as in the system's operational manuals. Gabriel hated it, but he trusted Kelvin more than he trusted anything else in this world, and Kelvin was trained for this, born for this. "Seek," Gabriel commanded. Kelvin moved forward in a low crouch, closing the distance to the compound entrance. 20 meters, 15, 10. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The crack of a high-powered rifle split the air, the report echoing off the rock formations until it was impossible to pinpoint origin. Dirt exploded 2 feet to Kelvin's left. The dog dove right on pure instinct, combat training overriding everything else. Gabriel's team scattered, finding whatever cover existed, rifles searching for the shooter. "Sniper," someone shouted. Unnecessary, everyone knew. Second shot, third, fourth, rounds impacting in a pattern that said the shooter was tracking, adjusting, zeroing in, not spray and pray, professional work, someone who knew what they were doing. Gabriel's brain processed the angles in the fragmented, accelerated way combat forces on you. Shooter was elevated, had to be. The trajectory was wrong for ground level. He scanned the compound roofline, the rock formations beyond, looking for the glint of scope glass or the shadow of a concealed position. Fifth shot hit the ground between Gabriel's boots. The message was clear, "You're next." Gabriel dropped behind a boulder that wasn't thick enough to stop a 7.6 tomb round if the shooter adjusted angle. His heart slammed against his ribs. Kelvin was still exposed, 20 meters of open ground between them, no cover, nowhere to hide. The dog had gone to ground in a shallow depression that offered concealment but no protection. "Kelvin, return," Gabriel shouted. The dog's head came up. Their eyes met across the distance, and Gabriel saw the calculation happen in real time, Kelvin measuring the angles, the distance, the probability of making it back alive. "Sixth shot." Kelvin exploded into motion, sprinting toward Gabriel in a dead run, 60 pounds of muscle and determination covering ground faster than should be possible. The rifle cracked again. Again. The shooter was tracking him, leading him, waiting for the moment when speed and trajectory intersected. Gabriel saw it before it happened, saw the geometry of death aligning. The angle was perfect. Kelvin's sprint would carry him directly into the kill zone. The next shot wouldn't miss. "DOWN," Gabriel screamed. But Kelvin didn't go down, he accelerated. Because he'd seen what Gabriel had seen, he'd calculated the same angles, and he'd made a different choice. The shot that was meant for Gabriel, the round that had his name on it, aimed at the center mass of his body armor, where kinetic force would stop his heart even if the bullet didn't penetrate, never reached its target. Kelvin jumped. Not to evade, not to find cover. He jumped directly into the bullet's path, placing his body between Gabriel and the incoming round like he was blocking a tackle, like his flesh and bone could somehow stop physics and momentum and death itself. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting meat. Kelvin's body jerked midair. His trajectory altered. He crashed into the ground 3 feet from Gabriel, momentum carrying him into a tumbling roll that ended in a sprawl of limbs and dust. No, the sound that came out of Gabriel wasn't words. It was something primal, something that bypassed language entirely. He was moving before conscious thought caught up. Hands on Kelvin, searching for the wound, finding blood, too much blood, soaking into the iron and gold coat and turning it black. Kelvin's eyes were wide, shocked, gasping for air that wouldn't come properly. His right side was shredded, ribs visible through torn muscle, entry wound that looked catastrophic. But no exit wound. The bullet was still inside him. "Medic," Gabriel screamed into his radio. "K9 down, I need medevac now." Return fire erupted around them. The element had located the sniper's position and was suppressing it with everything they had. Someone threw smoke. Purple haze filled the air, obscuring them from the shooter's sight line. Gabriel dragged Kelvin behind the boulder, hands slipping in blood, Kelvin's blood, the dog's body a dead weight that shouldn't be dead, couldn't be dead, because if Kelvin died then Gabriel's life ended too. "Stay with me, brother," Gabriel choked. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to leave me." Kelvin's paw moved weakly, pressing against Gabriel's vest. His eyes found Gabriel's face, and somehow, impossibly, his tail thumped once against the ground. "Still here, still fighting, we're good." Except the blood kept coming, and the medevac was 8 minutes out, and Gabriel held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, while his soul screamed at the injustice of a dog taking a bullet meant for him. The extraction was chaos. Gabriel carrying Kelvin through smoke and gunfire while the element provided cover. The helicopter's rotors drowning out everything except Gabriel's voice in Kelvin's ear, repeating the same words over and over. "Hold on, just hold on. I've got you." The field surgeons saved Kelvin's life, removed bone fragments, repaired torn muscle, stabilized him enough to survive transport to the base hospital. They told Gabriel the bullet had fragmented on impact with Kelvin's ribs. They'd removed most of it, most. But not all. Because 14 months later, lying on an examination table with 33 minutes before a euthanasia order would end him, Kelvin still carried a piece of that round inside him, hidden, silent, slowly destroying him from within while he refused to show weakness, because showing weakness meant getting left behind. And Gabriel, kneeling beside him in the present, finally understood. Kelvin hadn't recovered from that ambush, he just refused to quit. Miss Jean's hands moved across Kelvin's body with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 12 years learning to read pain in creatures that couldn't speak. Her fingers pressed gently along his ribcage, starting at the shoulder and working backward in a grid pattern. Systematic, clinical, searching for the thing her training told her had to be there, the source of the localized trauma that didn't match organ failure. Kelvin's breathing remained shallow. His eyes tracked Miss Jean's movements with dulled awareness, the clouds of exhaustion making everything distant. But when her fingers reached his left side, approximately 6 inches behind his shoulder blade, his entire body went rigid. A yelp tore from his throat, sharp, sudden, involuntary. Gabriel's hand tightened on Kelvin's neck. "What did you find?" Miss Jean didn't answer immediately. Her fingers stayed in position, applying the lightest pressure, feeling for something beneath the surface. Her expression shifted from concentration to confusion to something that looked like horror slowly crystallizing into certainty. "There's a mass here," she said quietly. "Dense, irregular, it's not organic tissue." She pressed fractionally harder. Kelvin's back legs spasmed, claws scraping against the metal table. His breathing accelerated, each inhale coming faster and shallower. Not the slow shutdown of organ failure, the acute response of a body reacting to specific, localized agony. "It's deep," Miss Jean continued, her voice taking on the detached quality of a clinician processing data. "Buried in the muscle layer. That's why we missed it on the initial examination. His coat is so thick here, and the muscle tissue has—" She paused, fingers exploring the area with feather-light touches. "The muscle has built up around it. Scar tissue, encapsulation." Gabriel's blood went cold. "How long?" "Months, maybe longer." Miss Jean looked up, her eyes sharp now, all the earlier grief burned away by professional focus. "This isn't recent trauma, Gabriel, this is old. Whatever's in there, his body has been trying to wall it off, and it's been failing." She moved to the supply cabinet, pulling out clippers and antiseptic. "I need to shave this area. I need to see the skin." Her hands worked quickly, the electric clippers buzzing as they removed the iron and gold fur in a patch roughly 4 inches square. The sound made Kelvin's ears flatten, but he didn't fight. He just lay there, trembling, trusting Gabriel to keep him safe even as every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. The skin beneath the fur appeared pale, almost translucent where it stretched over muscle. Miss Jean sprayed antiseptic, wiping away the excess with gauze. Then she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "There," she breathed. Gabriel leaned in beside her. At first he saw nothing, just skin, just the slight irregularity of scar tissue that could have been from anything. But then Miss Jean's finger pointed to a spot barely visible against Kelvin's skin, a small discoloration, slightly raised, no larger than a pencil eraser. "Entry point," Miss Jean said. "Healed over, probably weeks ago, maybe months." She grabbed a penlight, shining it at an angle across the skin. The scar became more visible in the raking light, a circular pattern consistent with puncture trauma. "This is a penetration wound. Something went into him here and never came out." Gabriel's mind flashed back to the ambush, the bullet striking Kelvin mid-jump, the field surgeons telling him they'd removed fragments, most of it, most. "Not all." "We need imaging," Miss Jean said, already moving toward the door. "X-ray, now, Rodriguez," she called into the hallway. "I need the portable unit in here, immediately." Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, eyes red-rimmed but alert. "What's happening?" "We're about to find out if we almost killed a dog for the wrong reason." The portable X-ray machine rolled into the room 3 minutes later, a boxy device on wheels that looked older than Gabriel. Miss Jean positioned it with practiced efficiency, adjusting the angle, checking the settings. She pulled a lead apron over her scrubs and handed one to Gabriel. "You should step out," she said. "I'm staying." She didn't argue, just nodded and positioned the imaging plate beneath Kelvin's body, centering it on the area where she'd found the entry wound. Kelvin's eyes found Gabriel's face, and Gabriel leaned down, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "Almost done, brother," he whispered. "Just hold still, let her see what's hurting you." The machine hummed, a brief whine of energy building, then a click so quiet Gabriel almost missed it. "Got it," Miss Jean said. She pulled the imaging plate free and carried it to the digital reader mounted on the wall, slid it into the slot. The screen flickered to life, pixels resolving into shades of gray and white and black, the internal architecture of Kelvin's body rendered visible. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Miss Jean said something in French that Gabriel didn't understand, but recognized as profanity from the tone. The image was clear, horrifically clear. There, embedded deep in the muscle tissue of Kelvin's left side, approximately 2 centimeters from his spine, was a jagged shard of metal. It showed up brilliant white against the gray of tissue and bone, roughly 7 millimeters long, irregular in shape, with sharp edges that had clearly been part of something larger before fragmentation. A 7.62 bullet fragment. Miss Jean's finger traced the outline on the screen. "It's migrated," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "See this? The entry point is here." She indicated a spot 6 inches away from where the fragment currently sat. But the fragment has moved deeper over time, probably through muscle contraction, physical activity. Every time he ran, every time he jumped, every time he worked, it shifted, millimeter by millimeter. "Toward his spine," Gabriel said numbly. "Toward his spine," Miss Jean confirmed. "It's pressing against the nerve bundle here." She pointed to a shadow on the X-ray where the metal kissed the edge of Kelvin's vertebral column. "That's what's causing the pain, the neurological symptoms, the apparent organ failure. It's not his organs at all. It's nerve compression causing his entire system to misfire." Gabriel stared at the image. That tiny shard of metal, no bigger than a child's fingernail, had been slowly killing Kelvin for 14 months. 14 months of Kelvin hiding the pain, compensating, refusing to show weakness, because in the world they operated in, weakness meant being decommissioned. Weakness meant being left behind. "He knew," Gabriel said hoarsely. "He knew something was wrong. He's been suffering this whole time, and he never showed it." "Dogs hide pain," Miss Jean said. "Especially working dogs. They're bred for it, trained for it. They'll work until they physically can't anymore. And Kelvin," her voice caught, "Kelvin is the most stoic dog I've ever examined. I've seen him come through procedures that would have other dogs whimpering for days. He never made a sound." Gabriel's vision blurred. He looked away from the X-ray, back to Kelvin on the table. The dog's eyes were half closed, body trembling with exhaustion that came from months of fighting a silent war inside his own flesh. "Can you remove it?" Gabriel asked. Miss Jean was quiet for a long moment. "It's possible, but it's delicate. The fragment is millimeters from his spinal cord. One wrong move." "Can you remove it?" She met his eyes. "Yes, I can remove it, but Gabriel, the euthanasia order is based on organ failure," Gabriel cut her off, "which he doesn't have. This is trauma. This is treatable. They can't kill him for having a bullet fragment I can fix. They can if command decides the surgery isn't worth the cost." Gabriel looked at the clock. 05:41, 19 minutes before the authorization went into effect. "Then we'd better work fast," he said. Miss Jean pulled out her phone, already dialing. "I'm calling the base commander. He needs to see this X-ray. He needs to know." The phone rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. She tried again, same result. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "He's not answering." "Then we go over his head. I'll contact regional command, medical oversight." But even as she said it, both of them knew the truth. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and they had 19 minutes. Kelvin's tail moved weakly against the table, still fighting, still holding on. Still trusting Gabriel to save him. The phone call came at 05:52. 8 minutes before the euthanasia authorization would take effect. Miss Jean had just finished prepping the surgical suite, laying out instruments with hands that moved too fast, driven by the knowledge that every second mattered. Gabriel stood beside Kelvin, one hand resting on the dog's head, feeling each labored breath like it might be the last. Miss Jean's phone buzzed against the metal tray. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression went carefully neutral. "It's Base Commander Voss." She answered on speaker. "Colonel Voss, thank you for returning my call. I need to discuss." "Dr. Laurent." The voice that came through was crisp, authoritative, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I'm aware of the situation with MWD Kelvin. I've reviewed the documentation you sent, the X-ray image." Miss Jean's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Then you understand we need to delay the euthanasia order. This isn't organ failure, sir. It's treatable trauma, a retained bullet fragment, with surgical intervention." "I understand perfectly, Doctor." Voss cut her off with the precision of someone used to conversations being one-directional. "Which is why I'm calling to clarify command's position. The euthanasia authorization stands. The room went silent except for Kelvin's breathing. Gabriel's hand tightened on the dog's fur. "Sir," Miss Jean said slowly, her professional composure cracking at the edges, "I don't think you heard me. Kelvin doesn't have organ failure. He has a foreign object causing nerve compression. We can remove it. He can recover fully." "I heard you, doctor, and my answer remains unchanged." "On what grounds?" Miss Jean's voice rose despite her obvious effort to control it. "The original authorization was based on terminal organ failure. That diagnosis is incorrect. Medical ethics require—" "Medical ethics are a luxury we afford when resources permit," Voss interrupted. "Let me be clear about the reality of this situation. MWD Kelvin is 6 years old, already past optimal operational age. The surgery you're proposing would require anesthesia, surgical time, postoperative care, rehabilitation. Estimated cost, $15,000 to $20,000. Estimated recovery time, 6 to 8 weeks, during which the asset would be non-operational." Gabriel's blood turned to ice. Asset, not dog, not partner, not the decorated war dog who'd saved more lives than Voss had probably seen in his entire career sitting behind a desk. "Asset versus," Voss continued, "euthanasia followed by replacement with a younger dog already trained and ready for deployment. Total cost, $3,000 for a dog we already have in the pipeline. Zero downtime. The mathematics are straightforward, doctor." "This is a living being," Miss Jean said, and Gabriel heard something dangerous creeping into her voice. "Not a budget line item." "This is a military working dog," Voss corrected. "Property of the United States government, subject to the same cost-benefit analysis as any other equipment. We don't repair vehicles when replacement is more economical. We don't rebuild weapons systems when newer models are available. The same principle applies here." "Dogs aren't weapons systems." "In terms of resource allocation, they absolutely are. And Handler Reyes needs to understand that emotional attachment doesn't change operational reality. We have a dozen qualified K9 handlers who can work with a replacement dog. The mission continues regardless." Gabriel stepped forward, pulled the phone closer. "Kelvin saved my life." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Handler Reyes, I appreciate your service, and I understand you have a bond with this animal, but personal feelings cannot dictate resource management decisions that affect the entire base budget." "He took a bullet meant for me," Gabriel said, his voice low and controlled in the way that scared people who knew him well. 14 months ago, that fragment in his spine, that's from jumping in front of a sniper round. He gave everything for this mission, for this country, and you're telling me he's not worth $20,000. I'm telling you that every dollar we spend on a single dog is a dollar we can't spend on training, equipment, or other personnel who are still operational. It's unfortunate that Kelvin was injured in the line of duty, but that doesn't change the economic calculation." "Economic calculation." Gabriel repeated the words like they tasted poisonous. "You're putting a price tag on loyalty." "I'm doing my job, which is to ensure this base operates efficiently with limited resources. And right now, you're asking me to authorize an expensive surgery with uncertain outcomes on an asset that's already been deemed expendable by qualified medical personnel based on the information available at the time." "The information was wrong," Miss Jean interjected. "The diagnosis was incorrect. That's why I'm calling you, sir, to correct a mistake before it becomes irreversible." "Dr. Laurent, I understand you're emotionally invested in this case, but from an operational standpoint, the outcome is the same whether Kelvin dies from organ failure or from an untreated bullet fragment. He's non-operational. He's unlikely to return to full duty even with surgery, and the cost of keeping him alive exceeds the value he can provide going forward." Gabriel looked down at Kelvin. The dog's eyes were open, watching him with an expression that held no understanding of the conversation happening above him, no comprehension that his life was being measured in dollars and spreadsheets and operational efficiency. He just knew Gabriel was there, and that meant everything was going to be okay. Because Gabriel had never let him down. And Gabriel wasn't about to start now. Then I'll pay for it myself, Gabriel said. Voss laughed, actually laughed. Handler Reyes, you don't have authorization to contract private veterinary care for military property, and even if you did, once Kelvin is euthanized under proper orders, the issue becomes moot. I'm requesting an exception to policy based on Denid, the euthanasia order stands. It will be executed at 600 hours as scheduled. Dr. Laurent, if you refuse to comply, I will have you relieved and replaced with a veterinarian who understands that following orders isn't optional. Am I clear? Miss Jean looked at Gabriel. Her eyes held the same fury he felt burning in his chest. Crystal clear, sir, she said, her voice deadly calm. Good, I expect confirmation that the order has been executed by 6:15. Voss out. The line went dead. Gabriel checked his watch, 05:56, 4 minutes. He's not here, Gabriel said quietly. Voss isn't in this room. He doesn't have to look Kelvin in the eyes, doesn't have to see what he's killing. He just has to sign a form and move on to the next item on his agenda. Miss Jean set the phone down with controlled precision. The system doesn't care about sacrifice. It doesn't care that Kelvin earned the right to be saved. It just sees numbers on a balance sheet and makes the efficient choice. Would you have let a partner die just to follow a rule? Gabriel asked, though he already knew her answer. Would you let bureaucracy decide that a hero's life isn't worth the cost of saving it? No, Miss Jean said simply, I wouldn't. Gabriel met her eyes. Then we have 4 minutes to decide if we are following orders or doing what's right. Kelvin's tail moved weakly against the table. Still fighting. Still trusting. Still believing Gabriel would find a way. If you despise the kind of gatekeeping that discards the brave the moment they become inconvenient, if you believe some things matter more than spreadsheets and efficiency reports, if you think loyalty should flow both ways, like this video to show your support for Gabriel. Because what happens next will determine whether the system wins or whether one handler's refusal to abandon his brother changes everything. The clock ticked towards 600, and Gabriel made his choice. Miss Jean's hands didn't shake when she made the first incision. The scalpel moved with surgical precision through skin and subcutaneous tissue, following the landmark she'd marked with a surgical pen, a line directly over the entry wound that had been hidden for 14 months beneath iron and gold fur and scar tissue, and Kelvin's stubborn refusal to quit. Gabriel stood 3 feet away, positioned where he could see without interfering. Rodriguez and Bennett had been ordered to wait outside. This was between Gabriel, Miss Jean, and the fragment of metal that was slowly killing his brother. Kelvin was under general anesthesia, his breathing regulated by a ventilator that hissed and clicked in steady rhythm. Monitors beeped softly, displaying vitals that looked stronger than they had an hour ago, as if Kelvin's body knew help was finally coming and had decided to hold on just a little longer. Miss Jean had ignored Voss's order, had locked the clinic door at 05:58, and made the decision that her oath to do no harm superseded the chain of command. The euthanasia authorization had come and gone at 600, unenforced, while she'd been prepping Kelvin for surgery that command had explicitly forbidden. She'd be court-martialed for this. Probably, Gabriel would face charges for disobeying a direct order, definitely. Neither of them cared. The incision deepened, blood welled up, controlled and expected. Miss Jean's hands moved with the confidence of 12 years' experience, cutting through layers of tissue with movements so economical they looked choreographed. Scalpel, retractor, cautery to seal the bleeders, the smell of burning flesh mixed with antiseptic. There's significant scarring, Miss Jean murmured, more to herself than to Gabriel. The muscle tissue has formed adhesions around the fragment. It's going to be delicate. Her fingers probed gently, exploring the tissue plane. Gabriel watched the monitors, watching Kelvin's heart rate stay steady, watching the oxygen saturation hold at 98%. Every number was a promise that Kelvin was still here, still fighting, still giving them time to fix what had been broken. Miss Jean switched to a smaller scalpel. I can feel it. It's deeper than the X-ray suggested. The scar tissue is dense. His body really tried to wall this off. She cut carefully, methodically, peeling back layers of muscle that had knitted themselves around the foreign object like biological armor. The tissue was angry, inflamed, hypervascular, bleeding more than it should. Evidence of chronic irritation, the body's losing battle against metal that didn't belong. Suction, Miss Jean said. Gabriel moved to the tray, grabbed the suction device, held it where she indicated. Blood cleared from the surgical field, and there, visible for the first time, was the edge of the fragment. It gleamed dull silver under the surgical lights. Jagged, irregular, the torn edge of a bullet that had fragmented on impact with Kelvin's ribs and left this shard behind to migrate through muscle and tissue until it found the worst possible resting place. Miss Jean's hands stopped moving. Gabriel saw her eyes widen behind the surgical loops she wore, saw her take a breath that wasn't quite steady. What? Gabriel asked, his voice tight. Miss Jean's voice was very quiet. It's closer than I thought. She adjusted the retractors, spreading the incision wider to improve visibility. The fragment became fully visible. 7 millimeters of twisted metal, one edge sharp as a blade, positioned at an angle that made Gabriel's stomach drop. How close? He asked. Miss Jean didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the fragment with the expression of someone doing calculations that had life-or-death consequences. Her right hand moved to a probe, touching the metal gently, assessing its position. 4 millimeters, she said finally. The tip of the fragment is 4 millimeters from the spinal cord. 4 millimeters, less than the width of a pencil, less than the thickness of 2 coins stacked together. The difference between Kelvin walking out of this clinic and being paralyzed for life. The fragment is also partially embedded in the bone, Miss Jean continued, her voice taking on the detached tone of a doctor delivering bad news. See this edge? It's caught in the transverse process of the vertebra. That's why it stopped migrating. It hit bone and lodged there. Can you remove it? Gabriel asked. Miss Jean's hands moved to position forceps around the fragment. The instruments looked huge compared to the tiny piece of metal, like trying to perform watchmaking with pliers. She adjusted her grip, adjusted again. Her hands were perfectly steady. Then she tried to lift the fragment. It didn't move. She applied fractionally more pressure. The fragment shifted a millimeter, then caught, stuck. The scar tissue and bone held it like it had been welded in place. It's adhered, Miss Jean said. The tissue has grown around it, if I pull too hard. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. If she pulled too hard, the fragment would tear free along with tissue and bone, could shift the wrong direction, could move those 4 millimeters and sever the spinal cord that made the difference between a dog who could walk and a dog who couldn't. Miss Jean's hands started to shake. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a fine tremor in her fingers, barely visible, the physical manifestation of adrenaline and fear, and the crushing weight of knowing that one wrong move would destroy everything. She pulled her hands back, set the forceps down, closed her eyes for 3 seconds. I need a moment, she said. Gabriel looked at the monitors. Kelvin's vitals were stable, but anesthesia couldn't last forever. They had a window, and that window was closing. You can do this, Gabriel said quietly. Miss Jean opened her eyes. They were bright with unshed tears and fury at herself for showing weakness. Gabriel, if I slip, if my hand moves 1 millimeter in the wrong direction. You won't. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Gabriel stepped closer to the table, looking down at Kelvin's unconscious form. Because you're the person who found this when everyone else missed it. You're the one who stopped that needle when you saw something was wrong. You're the one who defied a colonel's direct order because you knew saving Kelvin was more important than following rules. He met her eyes. Your hands are shaking because you care, because you understand what's at stake. But I've watched you work for 7 years. I've seen you put torn ligaments back together. I've seen you repair fractures that other vets said were impossible, and I've never seen you fail." Miss Jean took a breath, let it out slowly. The tremor in her hands decreased, didn't disappear but became manageable, controllable. "If this goes wrong," she started. "It won't," Gabriel said, "because Kelvin didn't survive 14 months with that fragment in his spine just to lose now. He held on this long. He waited for us to find it. He's still fighting." Gabriel's hand rested on Kelvin's paw, feeling the warmth there, the pulse still steady beneath fur and skin. "Now we fight for him." Miss Jean picked up the forceps again. Her hands were steadier now, driven by something deeper than technique. She positioned the instrument around the fragment with the delicacy of someone defusing a bomb. Because that's what this was, a bomb that had been ticking inside Kelvin's body for over a year, and now they were trying to remove it without detonation. "I'm going to cut the adhesions first," she said, her voice back to clinical precision. "Separate the fragment from the surrounding tissue, then I'll extract it in one smooth motion. No pulling, no torque, straight vertical lift." She switched to micro-scissors, began cutting the scar tissue fiber by fiber, each strand released with a tiny pop Gabriel could hear in the quiet room. The fragment shifted fractionally, freed from biological anchors. "Almost there," Miss Jean murmured. "Just a few more." The fragment moved suddenly, not from her cutting, from something else, from Kelvin's body itself, some involuntary muscle contraction that shifted everything by a fraction of a millimeter. Toward the spine. Miss Jean's hands froze. Gabriel, his muscle tone just increased, the anesthesia. Gabriel checked the monitors. Kelvin's vitals were spiking, heart rate climbing, body fighting the anesthesia, trying to wake up. "How long?" Gabriel asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Miss Jean's hands were shaking again, this time with urgency, not fear. She had one chance. And Kelvin was running out of time. The monitor alarm started as a single beep, persistent, insistent, wrong. Then it became a sustained tone that filled the surgical suite like a siren announcing the end of everything. Gabriel's eyes snapped to the screen. The green line that had been spiking in steady rhythm, mapping Kelvin's heartbeat in peaks and valleys, went flat, horizontal, the universal symbol for cessation, for death. "No," Gabriel breathed. Miss Jean's hands moved with speed that contradicted the tremor from moments before. She abandoned the fragment, left the forceps in position, and pressed her fingers against Kelvin's chest, feeling for the pulse that the monitor said wasn't there. "Cardiac arrest," she said, voice sharp and clinical. "Gabriel, I need you to." "What do you need?" Gabriel was already moving, hands ready, waiting for orders, refusing to accept what the flat line meant. "Chest compressions, now." Miss Jean's hands moved to the drug tray, drawing up epinephrine with movements so practiced they looked automated. "Place your hands here, 2 fingers below the incision, avoid the surgical site. 30 compressions, hard and fast." Gabriel positioned his hands on Kelvin's chest, feeling ribs beneath fur and skin and the terrible stillness of a body that had stopped animating itself. He pushed down. The resistance was wrong, not the living springback of healthy tissue, but something slacker, defeated. He counted, 1, 2, 3, pushing life back into Kelvin with his hands because his hands were all he had. 10, 15, 20. The rhythm became automatic muscle memory from combat first aid training that he'd hoped never to use on Kelvin. 28, 29, 30. Miss Jean injected epinephrine directly into Kelvin's IV line. Again, keep going. Gabriel compressed. The monitor stayed flat. The tone kept screaming its single note of failure. "Come on, brother," Gabriel said through gritted teeth. "You don't get to quit now, not after everything, not after." His voice cracked. 30. Miss Jean grabbed the defibrillator paddles, charging them with a whine that built in pitch. Clear. Gabriel pulled back. Miss Jean positioned the paddles on Kelvin's chest. Pressed. Kelvin's body jerked with electrical current, muscles contracting involuntarily, limbs twitching in a parody of life. The monitor stayed flat. Again, Miss Jean said, charging to 200, clear. Another shock, another convulsion. Kelvin's body arched on the table, then collapsed back into stillness. The line didn't change. Gabriel's hands went back to Kelvin's chest. Compressions, 30 more. He was crying now, tears running unchecked down his face, dripping onto Kelvin's fur. His hands pushed life into a body that wasn't accepting it, wasn't responding, wasn't fighting back. Kelvin, please, Gabriel choked. I'm right here, I'm not leaving, just come back, just. Gabriel, Miss Jean's voice cut through his desperation. I need room to work. I'm helping. You're in the way. Her eyes were hard, professional, burning, with the same refusal to surrender that Gabriel felt. If you want him to have a chance, you need to let me do my job. Gabriel's hands stopped mid-compression. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to keep fighting, to refuse to step away from Kelvin even for a second, because stepping away felt like abandonment. Gabriel, Miss Jean's voice softened fractionally. I need space. I need to intubate, to get more drugs into him, to see what's happening, and I can't do that with you hovering over me. The door opened. Rodriguez stood there, face pale, eyes wide. Behind him, Bennett looked stricken. We heard the alarm, Rodriguez said. Miss Jean didn't look away from Kelvin. Get him out of here, now. No, Gabriel said. I'm staying, he needs me to save his life, and I can't do that with you distracting me. Miss Jean's voice turned razor-sharp. Rodriguez, that's an order. Remove Handler Reyes from the surgical suite. Rodriguez moved forward, hands reaching for Gabriel's shoulders. Come on, brother, let her work. Gabriel shrugged him off. I'm not leaving him. You're not helping him either. Rodriguez's grip tightened, stronger now, insistent. You want him to live, let the vet do her job. Gabriel looked down at Kelvin. The dog lay motionless on the table, chest open, fragment still partially embedded, body not breathing on its own. The ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm, forcing air into lungs that should have been drawing breath independently. But the heart that had beaten beside Gabriel's for 7 years, that had sustained Kelvin through 4 deployments and countless missions and an ambush that should have killed him, was silent. Bennett appeared on Gabriel's other side. Together, they pulled him backward. Gabriel's hands reached for Kelvin, fingers grasping at air, at nothing. No, I can't. He needs to know I'm here. He knows, Rodriguez said, voice thick with his own grief. He knows, Gabe, now let her save him. They dragged Gabriel through the door. He fought them for 3 steps, then his legs gave out. He collapsed against the hallway wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold linoleum floor. Through the window in the door, he could see Miss Jean working, hands moving in controlled frenzy, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, refusing to accept the flatline that continued its merciless tone. Rodriguez sat beside him. Bennett stood with his back against the opposite wall, head down, hands clenched into fists. The silence in the hallway was absolute. No radio chatter, no footsteps, no sounds of the base waking up around them. Just the muffled alarm from inside the surgical suite and Gabriel's ragged breathing and the crushing weight of waiting. Gabriel's phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Finally he looked. Messages from handlers in his unit. Word had spread. Everyone knew Kelvin was dying. Everyone knew Gabriel was watching it happen. Praying for you, brother Kelvin's, the toughest dog. I know whatever you need. The messages blurred. Gabriel let the phone drop to the floor beside him. His hands were shaking, the same hands that had just been pushing life into Kelvin's chest. They felt useless now, empty. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. 7 years, that's how long he'd been responsible for keeping Kelvin alive. 7 years of checking him after missions, monitoring his health, watching for any sign of injury or illness. And he'd missed it, had missed the fragment slowly migrating toward Kelvin's spine for 14 months, had missed the signs that something was catastrophically wrong until it was almost too late. Maybe was too late. The alarm tone changed pitch suddenly. Gabriel's head snapped up. Through the window, he saw Miss Jean step back from the table, saw her look at the monitor. saw her shoulders sag in a way that made Gabriel's blood turn to ice. Rodriguez's hand gripped Gabriel's shoulder. Wait, just wait, let her. The door opened. Miss Jean stood there in blood-spattered scrubs, surgical mask pulled down around her neck. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, and Gabriel couldn't read the expression on her face, couldn't tell if it was grief or relief or the terrible neutrality of someone about to deliver news that would break him. "He's stable," she said. The words didn't register immediately. Gabriel heard them, processed the sounds, but his brain refused to attach meaning because stable meant alive, and the flatline had meant dead, and he didn't know how to reconcile those contradictions. "What?" he managed. "His heart's beating again," Miss Jean said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "It took 4 rounds of epinephrine and 3 shocks, but he's back. Vitals are weak but present. He's alive, Gabriel." Gabriel tried to stand. His legs wouldn't cooperate. Rodriguez had to haul him upright, had to steady him when the world tilted sideways. "The fragment?" Gabriel asked. Miss Jean's expression shifted. "Still in him. When his heart stopped, I had to abandon the extraction. I couldn't risk." She stopped, started again. "He's alive, but the surgery isn't finished. The fragment is still there, still against his spine, and he's too unstable to continue." Gabriel stared at her. Kelvin was alive, but the thing killing him was still inside him, and they couldn't remove it without risking another cardiac arrest that he might not survive. They'd brought him back from death, but they hadn't saved him yet. 2 hours. That's how long Miss Jean waited for Kelvin's vitals to stabilize enough to risk continuing. 2 hours of Gabriel sitting on the floor outside the surgical suite, watching through the window as monitors beeped their fragile rhythm, as Miss Jean checked and rechecked readings, as Kelvin's body fought to maintain the heartbeat they'd shocked back into existence. Rodriguez brought coffee. Gabriel didn't drink it. Bennett offered food. Gabriel couldn't eat. The base came alive around them, morning formation, vehicle movements, the ordinary machinery of military routine. None of it mattered. The only thing that existed was the window and the dog on the other side of it, and the question of whether 2 hours would be enough. At 8:47, Miss Jean opened the door. "He's ready," she said, "as ready as he's going to be." Gabriel stood. His legs had gone numb from sitting, pins and needles shooting through his calves. He didn't care. "Can I?" "You can watch," Miss Jean said, "from here through the window, but you don't come inside. If his heart stops again and you're in the way, we lose seconds we can't afford." "Understood." Gabriel nodded, pressed his hands against the window glass, watched Miss Jean re-enter the surgical suite, re-glove, return to the table where Kelvin lay with his chest still open, fragments still embedded. Time still running out. She picked up the micro-scissors, returned to cutting adhesions with the same methodical precision she'd shown before cardiac arrest had interrupted everything. Each strand of scar tissue separated, each biological anchor released. The fragment shifted fractionally, freed incrementally, moving closer to extraction. Gabriel watched the monitors like they were the only things keeping him alive. Heart rate, steady. Oxygen saturation, 96%. Blood pressure, low but holding. Every number was a promise that Kelvin was still here, still fighting, still giving Miss Jean time to finish what she'd started. Miss Jean switched to forceps, positioned them around the fragment with movements so careful they looked like slow motion. Her hands were steady now, no tremor, no hesitation, just surgical precision driven by the knowledge that she wouldn't get a third chance. She lifted. The fragment moved, 1 millimeter, 2, resistance from tissue that didn't want to release its grip. Miss Jean's wrist rotated fractionally, changing the angle, finding the path of least resistance. 3 millimeters, 4. The fragment came free. Gabriel saw it happen through the window, saw the jagged piece of metal emerge from tissue and bone, saw Miss Jean lift it clear of the surgical site, saw her hands move it away from Kelvin's spine and into a metal tray where it landed with a soft clink. Out, finally out. Miss Jean's shoulders sagged for 1 second. Then she was moving again, checking for bleeding, inspecting the site where the fragment had lived for 14 months, ensuring no smaller pieces remained behind. Her hands worked quickly, efficiently, closing layers of tissue with sutures that would hold Kelvin together while his body healed from the inside out. 20 minutes later, she stepped back from the table. The surgical site was closed, bandaged. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, and Kelvin was still alive. Miss Jean pulled off her gloves, disposed of them, and came to the door. She looked exhausted, triumphant, furious, and relieved in equal measure. "It's done," she said. "The fragment is out. I've closed the incision. His vitals are stable. Now we wait for him to wake up." "How long?" Gabriel asked. 30 minutes, maybe longer. The anesthesia was deep. I had to keep him under longer than planned because of the cardiac arrest. His body needs time to metabolize the drugs." Gabriel nodded, couldn't speak. The relief was too big for words. Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. Bennett grinned through tears. And Gabriel returned to his position by the window and watched the dog, who'd saved his life, continue breathing on the other side of the glass. 43 minutes later, Kelvin's eyes opened. Not fully, not alert, just a flutter of lids, a crack of awareness breaking through the chemical fog, but it was enough to prove he was coming back, enough to prove they'd won. Miss Jean was beside him immediately, checking pupil response, monitoring vitals, ensuring the transition from unconscious to conscious was happening normally. Gabriel pressed harder against the window, hands flat against glass, every fiber of his being focused on the dog beginning to wake. Kelvin's head moved. A slight turn, nothing dramatic, just orientation. His eyes opened wider, pupils contracting in the surgical lights. His breathing changed from the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator to something shallower, faster, self-directed. Miss Jean removed the breathing tube. Kelvin coughed, blinked. His gaze swept the room in confusion. Where am I? What happened? Why does everything hurt? Before landing on the window. On Gabriel. Recognition hit like lightning. Kelvin's eyes focused, cleared. The fog lifted, and what remained was the same fierce intelligence that had always lived there, the same unbreakable connection that had formed 7 years ago and survived everything the world threw at it. Gabriel saw Kelvin try to move, saw him attempt to stand, to go to Gabriel, stopped only by the IV lines and monitoring equipment, and Miss Jean's gentle hands keeping him still. "Easy boy," Miss Jean murmured. "You're okay, you're safe. Gabriel's right there. He's not going anywhere." She looked at the window, at Gabriel, and nodded. Gabriel was through the door before conscious thought caught up, crossed the room in 3 strides. His hands found Kelvin's face, cradling it the way he'd done 10,000 times, feeling warmth and breath and life that had almost slipped away. "Hey, brother," Gabriel whispered, "welcome back." Kelvin's tail moved, weak, barely visible, but there, the universal signal, we're good, still here, still fighting. Gabriel pressed his forehead against Kelvin's, breathed in the scent of antiseptic and survival, felt tears running down his face, and didn't care because Kelvin was alive and awake, and the fragment was out, and they'd won. They'd actually won. The door opened. Rodriguez and Bennett entered, both of them grinning, both of them with eyes too bright. Behind them came other handlers. Word had spread. The entire K9 unit had been waiting, filling the doorway with faces Gabriel recognized, people he'd served with, worked beside, trained alongside. They weren't saying anything, just standing there, witnessing, supporting, proving that Gabriel and Kelvin weren't alone in this fight. Gabriel looked up, saw a dozen handlers, saw Miss Jean with her blood-spattered scrubs and exhausted triumph, saw Rodriguez with his hand on Bennett's shoulder, saw a community that had refused to let bureaucracy discard a hero without a fight. And Gabriel realized something that hit harder than any bullet. He wasn't alone, had never been alone. He'd spent 7 years believing the only thing he could trust was Kelvin, the only bond that mattered was the one between handler and dog. But standing here, surrounded by people who'd waited hours for news, who'd defied orders and risked careers, and refused to accept that loyalty could be measured in dollars. He'd been wronged. The system had wanted Kelvin gone, had authorized his death because a spreadsheet said he wasn't cost-effective, had tried to kill a decorated war dog to save resources. But the system had failed because people, actual human beings with hearts and souls and the capacity to choose right over easy, had stood in the way. Miss Jean had defied a direct order. Gabriel had refused to follow protocol. Rodriguez and Bennett had provided backup. The entire K9 unit had rallied. And Kelvin was alive because sometimes, when it matters most, loyalty wins over bureaucracy. Courage wins over convenience. And the people who understand what brotherhood means refuse to let the system discard the brave. The commander wanted him dead, Gabriel said quietly, looking at the faces crowded in the doorway. Wanted him euthanized to save money, treated him like broken equipment instead of a hero. He looked down at Kelvin, whose eyes were clear now, focused, watching Gabriel with absolute trust. But we didn't let him, we fought, and we won. Rodriguez stepped forward. Loyalty wins, brother, every single time. Bennett nodded. Loyalty wins. The other handlers echoed it, one by one, a chorus of voices turning two words into a declaration of war against every system, every protocol, every bureaucratic decision that treated warriors like assets and measured sacrifice in budget reports. Loyalty wins. And standing there with his hands on Kelvin's face, surrounded by people who understood what that meant, Gabriel finally believed it. If you stand against those who discard the brave the moment they become inconvenient, if you believe loyalty should flow both ways, if you despise commanders who treat heroes like trash, comment "Loyalty wins" below, because this story isn't just about one dog and one handler. It's about every single person who's ever refused to follow an unjust order, who's ever fought for what's right instead of what's easy, who's ever proven that some things matter more than spreadsheets. Kelvin's eyes closed, not in death, in rest, in the deep, healing sleep of a warrior who'd fought his last battle and survived. And Gabriel stayed beside him, keeping watch, keeping faith, keeping the promise he'd made 7 years ago, you and me, brother, all the way. They'd made it. Together.